So we're live at the Science of Consciousness conference in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm here with Jeremy Sherman, who is a journalist writing for Psychology Today and an author who specializes in the origins of life. Now, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's very nice to be here.
Would you like to add to my brief introduction?
Sure. I'm interested in how living systems interpret from the cradle at the origins of life to our grave situation. So I'm paying attention to interpretation from the origins of life to politics. Yes, I'm a writer, I'm a researcher also in origins of life research. And in social psychology, decision theory, and all of that as well. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned last night when we were having dinner by the pool over there that you also lived for 10 years on a... 7 years on a... Would it be right for me to describe it as a hippie commune?
Yeah, it was the world's largest hippie commune. It's called The Farm. It was 1,400 people in rural Tennessee. Yeah, so I've had a wonderful life. It's like I've gotten to take most of the rides in the amusement park. I've been a carpenter, I've been a plumber, I founded a nonprofit environmental organization. I worked in business, I was a consultant to organizations. So I've been all over the map.
And what can you, how would you summarize the commune that you lived on? Would you see it as a possible solution in terms of the way humanity living going forwards?
That was our sense of it. We were trying to exemplify the graceful way to live forward. Many would describe it not so much as a commune as an eco-village. And I left in part with the sense that the example wouldn't take. That people were not going to flock to it in droves, that in a way it was a function of a bunch of upper middle class counterculture people in a strange era when you thought, unlike today, that you had time and didn't have to worry about what you were going to do long term, that we could basically drop out of society, sign a vow of poverty, and live this simple voluntary peasant life as we described it. Then I went and did a master's in public policy, and at one point, and was taking a lot of courses in ecological economics, and at one point one of the leading experts in the field described the lifestyle that we had on the farm as where we all need to live, and I suddenly realized, no, I'm not going to find the answers for social change through this approach. I actually need to pay more attention to what's going on in the wetware, you could say, what it means for a living being to interpret. So that's the point at which I started to move away from politics and political campaigning and toward a deeper understanding of psychology and the complexities of living, of interpreting.
And what values or lifestyles do you think from that commune could be applied to contemporary society at large in order to perhaps reach some sort of sustainable equilibrium in the future?
Well, so I might have to answer a different question. I know the values we embraced, and I have many friends from the commune days and otherwise, since I live in Berkeley, who still espouse those values, but I came away thinking the values won't solve it. I have a lot of friends who think that love is the answer. I don't. I think that love is the question. What to love and what to hate, in fact, because I don't see how you can love something without hating its opposite. The more I love equality, the more I hate inequality, and I don't want to mince words about that. I think that the claim to embrace those values, which, by the way, seems to recur throughout history. All the great religions claim to be all embracing, all loving. They actually stunt growth on the values that interest me. I got interested in the tough judgment calls that life is dealing with, that echo in one format or another the Serenity Prayer. where there are two values, serenity and courage, that both sound like always values, but they can't be, because if you could always do both, always accept everything and always try to change everything, you wouldn't need the wisdom to know the difference. So I got really interested in that format, the Serenity Prayers format. I've probably written over 35 variations on it to deal with the tough judgment calls, some of which life has been dealing with since its origins. Like the question about what to be open to and what to be closed to. So the Commune had a lot of people who argued you should be open and tolerant of everything. Well, at the origins of life, you've got this fundamental question. You've got to let in the stuff you need in order to regenerate yourself and keep out the other stuff. So there's a kind of thisness, tough judgment call about what to let in and what to keep out. That kind of thing. I got interested in the pedigree of these tough judgment calls.
Yeah, well, Darwinian evolution is sort of opposite to that ideology. It's real dog-eat-dog.
Well, so it can be interpreted that way, but of course, if you've got multicellularity, you've got all sorts of cells that are sacrificing their autonomy for the whole. Very interesting topic in evolutionary theory. And then you've got the advocates of openness who argue that Darwin was misguided because actually cooperation drives it all. And I think that's absolutely half true. I mean, I agree with it wholeheartedly. That is, I'm interested in what to be open to, what to surrender into, and what to keep out. And so the kinds of arguments that argue for one or the other, they look like, to me, they're like antibodies trying to close a wound that will never close. The question of what to be open to and what to be closed to is going to be with me for my entire life. You don't get over that question. But these are attempts to try to close it once and for all with one side or the other. Competition or cooperation, accepting everything or trying to change everything. I understand the appetite for those half-sided treatments, but they're not interesting to me anymore as anything other than the natural human reaction to this wound that won't close, the tough judgment call that won't settle.
In our chat yesterday, you mentioned the like versus likely, and that really rung true for me because I've been to a lot of these kinds of conferences on consciousness and to try and find answers. And often what you like is what you romanticize, but it's often not likely, whereas theories often grounded in science which are more likely are just not so much like romantically inspiring.
Yes, I have colleagues who are working to make a romance out of the scientific story, and I appreciate that effort, but I don't take that route myself. So I'm quite committed to science in my work life. When I'm doing science, I want to be in pursuit of the likely story. That is, our best guesses at what's really true, whether I like them or not. And often they're stories I like, and sometimes they're stories I don't like, but I want to employ the power of neutral thinking when I'm doing science. At the same time, I'm human, and I want the likely story. So I want, in effect, intimacy with reality and intimacy with people. I want, including and chiefly myself. I want intimacy with myself, which is where the romantic story comes in. So how I balance that, I basically model it after how I deal with fiction. When I'm in fiction, I am romanticizing. I'm identifying with someone who finesses heroic work. I know it's fiction, but when I'm in it, I'm all the way in it. So I indulge my fantasies. I cultivate liked stories. I try to engage in what I'd call optimal illusion. That is, kidding myself where it helps me and not where it hurts me.
Now, there were two streams of dialogue there which kind of coalesce on work that Elizabeth Sahtouris has been very vocal about, and that is the current shift that is required for humanity to transcend our current limitations, those being we need to escape from the juvenile processes that we seem to have been stagnated in, and cooperate more and let go of the hero's journey myth?
Yes. So one of the effects of the power of neutral thinking is that I look at the upsides and downsides of things. That is, I look at a move like cooperation neutrally, and I try to understand its nature, and then I notice that it's got upsides and downsides. The stormtroopers were highly cooperative people, so the idea that we would just cooperate, if you take a grand view of history, the great movements are things that were designed to unite all people, and then you end up with whole factions of united people who I used to illustrate this in my psych classes by imagining the Christians and the Muslims kind of bumping into each other and saying, no, we're the ones who are going to bring the world unity. No, we are. That kind of competition. These are central themes in work like by a guy like David Sloan Wilson. That it's got its advantages and its disadvantages. And what you described, Elizabeth Sartori's work, I don't know it, but it does sound like part of that movement that wants to argue that we have to evolve towards greater cooperation.
Yeah, so she's an evolutionary biologist who studied the evolution particularly of bacteria and the jumps in evolution that were driven by cooperation rather than like independent trying to get above your competition.
Right, and Robert Wright does a whole lot of work in this area. He got very interested in zero-sum games, and he tends to downplay the perils of them. I mean, really, right now in the United States, for example, for a random example, 40% of Americans are totally loyal to the Donald Trump, Koch-Mercer movement, okay? So you can't argue that they're not cooperating. They really are in alignment. They have sacrificed their autonomy. They're no longer thinking independently. Is that a good thing? Not in my opinion. It's back to this question, where do I want to cooperate? Where do I want to compete? Where is it beneficial in the long run? And these are questions I'll argue we stunt our growth on if we make a virtue out of the move. The move is not the point. The move can be a good move or a bad move. I don't want to pretend that the move is inherently good or inherently bad. I want to be pragmatic and pay attention, keep my eyes on the prize, which is some kind of long-term benefit. So in the service of that, I have to neutralize my attention to the moves themselves. I very much want to be uncooperative with certain things, just for the record. And I don't think that's exclusively selfish. It's actually in the service of making the world a better place. There are things you shouldn't cooperate with.
Now, many people just point out, you know, Trump's done this today, Trump's done that today, what the hell's going on? They just point out the negatives of the administration. But there's always the yin and the yang, in my view, and I try to look at the positives. So in a way, it's like a wake-up call that he's managed to get in office and execute all these actions that most people on the planet are completely against. But perhaps it's what we needed most as a collectively as a species, to just be shaken up.
Yes. If we don't die from him, he'll make us stronger. Because it's how you wake up, you could say the equivalent of a cultural antibody system. I have for 20 years worked in something that I've recently decided to describe as psychoproctology. I'm very interested in the pursuit of an objective definition of butthead behavior. The way I framed it at first was a kind of a koan. What is a butthead if it's not just anybody I happen to butt heads with? And that's how most people define it. That is, this guy is passionately against me, therefore he's a butthead or an asshole. So there were years of me writing on the subject. I wrote about Trump 10 years ago. as a crystalline model of this kind of behavior. And there were years when people said, your life is nice. Why are you paying so much attention to these kinds of guys? My answer is because I'm not so busy with the morality of how people should behave, but I still need to put a leash on the behavior that is perilous to society. He is perfect for me. I feel for the last 2 years like an accountant before April 15th. This is my season because people's attention have turned towards his behavior, and I'm looking to generalize from him to get people at least curious about this question. Okay, what makes him bad for us? What makes him dangerous for us? I'll argue it's not what he believes. What he believes are props. They're just props he's using for some deeper core mission. What is that core mission? You can give it a name like, well, he's greedy. Well, so am I. It's a question of degree at that point. Well, he uses this move. Well, so do I. So it's not the moves. You could say, well, this is his motives. Well, the problem, motives are very hard to read. This is a real challenge for us when we try to challenge those people who are in support of him. Some of them are con artists. Some of them are idiots. Some of them are just marinated in that culture. If you misread their motives, it's a real problem. And yet I don't think there's a reliable source for identifying what their motives are. My focus with him has been mostly on what he gets for it. So I don't know why a jerk is a jerk, but I do know what they get for it. And what they get is feigned authority by means of unlimited hypocrisy and unlimited projection. So all of the moves are, I know you are, but what am I? They're an automatic deflection. And there are analogs in biology. That is, for an organism to stay alive, it has to protect against infection and prevent defection. Well, the loyalty that you see to him and the endless projection, where any attack on him, he can just flip it around. That's a kind of intrinsic aspect of what you get in any entity that is trying to grow itself. And he is, in a way, a pinnacle species. From an evolutionary perspective, he is a pinnacle cultural species. I hate him, but he would do really well if it weren't that we have this power to think about how to make a better world. He would prevail in the ruthless world of cooperation and competition, Darwin style. He'd do really well. Got to give him that.
So you've written extensively for Psychology Today. What sort of issues?
Well, it took me a while to figure out what the issues were. I had started out writing books. A bunch of ideas came to me all at once about 25 years ago as I started to make connections between different fields. The books didn't go well. It's very hard because I was basically trying to propose a worldview, and it's very hard to figure out how to present that all. I got into writing art. I started out actually because I couldn't get a word in edgewise. I was low status in meetings and stuff like that. So I started out writing limericks to convey these core ideas that I had. And then I started to write books. And then I kind of abandoned it. There was one I wrote called Negotiate with Yourself and Win. I wrote it 12 times. It's still in my drawer. I still agree with most of what's in it. I'd have to rewrite it a 13th time. But I got into writing articles, and anytime I got a feedback loop working where anytime I had an idea, I valued it because I could write an article about it, and I got immediate feedback that encouraged me to come up with more ideas. So I generate ideas at a fairly rapid rate, and articles as well. I've got 1,400 articles with Psychology Today. It took me looking back to recognize what the themes were. It's not like I started with themes, and I wasn't pitching much of anything. It's not like, and I didn't have one idea. I didn't suffer from only brainchild syndrome, because the ideas kept on coming, which also meant that I could kill them. You know, if this idea was stupid, I could drop it. But because I didn't have one precious idea, and I also wasn't an academic. Academics tends to make people have to canalize. You get branded to an idea.
Yes, we had this discussion last night as well, that I'm probably somewhat institutionalized compared to you. You lived on Hippie Commune. You've been quite a free thinker.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems I have with academia.
Yeah. It took me a while. For a while, I felt like I lost out because I got my Ph.D. around 38 years old. And it's too late to get a tenured position. They want you to be a slave to pay your dues for a while. And only recently have I realized, mostly in conversation with the notable, recognized big names, that I have way more latitude to think than they do. Not just outside my discipline. It's my middle-age spread. I'm just all over the map. But to change my mind. It's a latitude that's worth cultivating if you can afford it.
But it's also very difficult to get your foot in the door without the academic pedigree.
And I have the pedigree. I have. I was trying to collect all the letters in the alphabet after my name, but I ended up with 3 P's, which is way too many. So I'm happy to swap them. But I have a Ph.D. and a master's in public policy.
Okay.
So and I have some status, but not much. And yet, I find that you can engage people if you ask deep, engaging questions, even if you don't have status. Now, there will still be those who will simply dismiss me as not knowing because I don't have a title with the university. But in general, the freedom has proved worth it. The freedom to think it up a notch and then think it up another notch, to keep on playing with ideas, it's been worth it. If you can do that.
Okay. I'm actually currently studying psychology and neuroscience and mental health.
Yes.
And I struggle a little bit with the science. Not that I find it difficult, but that it seems to be very kind of niche, a little bit narrow-minded, and you got to be very careful with what you say. So, as I mentioned, with the podcast, I started off with scientists that are tethered to academic institutions, and then it became pretty obvious quickly, early on, that they were reluctant to really open up and talk about stuff that they wouldn't talk about off camera. And then the podcast started spreading to people that were totally open, such as people in the psychedelic scene, etc. And it's coming more and more to the forefront of neuroscience and psychology that psychedelics could be a potentially very valuable medicines for the future.
Yes.
Can you possibly comment?
Yes, I can comment. So, I haven't mentioned this here, but about 21 years ago, I chanced into the company of a Harvard neuroscientist who was unlike the other professors I had met. Someone who was ready to engage with whomever. Status was irrelevant to him. Rigor was crucial to him. And he was dealing with the underlying problem that I'll argue even the psychedelic research we've seen here doesn't address, which is heart. The sciences are carrying forward what I'll call an overstep in the right direction. For all that period after Aristotle until the scientific revolution, there was a sense that there was purpose to everything. That got taken up, especially once you had a God who yielded purpose, who basically imbued things with purpose. With the scientific so this is what Aristotle called final causality, that for which something occurs. That is, its use, its benefit, its ends. And then with the scientific revolution, Newton and the like, we started to realize that you could do a whole lot with mechanism alone, which is intuitive. That is, what we really recognize is what Aristotle called material and efficient cause. That is, I know concrete objects, I see them, I bump into them, I'm very familiar with the material, and I can see cause and effect relationships. So in the scientific revolution, final cause became the lost cause. There was an assumption that's been carried straight through into this conference, into conversations about psychedelics, that is trying to translate everything into cause and effect mechanism. And it leaves a desiccated world. Now, some of the most popular writers in this in this field, the consciousness field, are people who write very spirited, exciting prose about a spiritless world, about a world where it's all mechanism. So a Dan Dennett or Richard Dawkins fills you with joy. The New York Times described Selfish Gene as making every reader feel like a genius. Mm-hmm. But the world he's describing has no heart. There's no liking in it. There's no emergence or origins of like, because it's all chemicals bouncing against each other. And to this day at this conference, that is a major issue. So Deacon, Terence Deacon, the guy who I started working with 20 years ago, this Harvard neuroscientist who just embraced me, even though I've had barely any background in this. We've been jamming together for 21 years, very rigorous jamming. But he's never pulled rank on me. We just work on the ideas. He's just interested in solving this question: how does mattering emerge from matter?
So Terence Deacon is an anthropologist.
He's a biological anthropologist, neuroscientist.
Okay.
But he's actually broader than that. Those happen to be the departments he ended up in. No, he's recognized among philosophers. Dan Dennett admires his work and declares that Deacon made him recognize that there might be something to what Dan disparages as the romantic view of the world, which has heart in it. Dan will disparage all of that as just hoping that there's heart. I think that Dan romanticizes anti-romanticism, that his hero journey is to be the one who proves to the world that we can do without heart. It's like the culmination of the scientific revolution and finally abolishing final cause once and for all.
So
that is a very romantic view.
Like what Dawkins said, that we're just merely meat robots.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so that's not gonna win over. It's gonna win over a certain breed of glotaholic, someone who wants to engage in. So there's wishful thinking, but I also think there's dreadful thinking, which is, it's got to be true because you dread it. Yes. So there is a kind of glotaholic, someone who wants to feel vindicated that they have the last word on the subject. Through evolutionary theory, the argument that there is no mattering, all there is replicating molecules and their robotic vehicles. I got turned on to the field through those guys, and then rather than landing there once and for all, I got interested in the questions that followed from it, led me to evolutionary psychology, then complexity theory, and then meeting Deacon, who is really trying to figure out how mattering emerges from matter. He tends to write rather coldly about the subject. That is, he's not a flowery prose stylist. I'm more likely to play that role in our work. But that's what I'll argue is missing here. There is no sense of why you have even feelings, let alone concepts or consciousness. And it's mostly done through a kind of denial that you have those things really, a pedagogical license to pretend as though you do. Yeah, so molecules aren't selfish, but we might as well talk as though they are, because it's tantamount to. And what I'll call equivocation, which is basically talking out both sides of your mouth, where you can say dopamine is a reward, it causes pleasure. Wait a second, it's a chemical. So you haven't explained how you jump from the cause and effect world of chemistry to the means to ends world of rewards and punishments and values. Many people here would argue that evolution solves it. I don't think it does. Evolution explains how values change over time, but not how value emerges in the universe so that they might change. I think of natural selection. Explaining life with natural selection is like explaining mountains with erosion. It explains how they're shaped, but not what's shaped. That you actually need you need organisms before you have evolution, and hence our work on the origins of mattering, which is present in all organisms. This tree right here, it's not conscious, it's not having any feelings, and yet it is trying. So what is trying, and how did it start? With no smoke and mirrors, no equivocation, no talking out both sides of your mouth, how does it start? that's been Deacon and my work for 20 years with colleagues.
So this is a book which more or less encapsulates the work done by Terence Deacon.
Yes.
And I just pulled this up off Amazon. So in a nutshell, it discusses themes like if the universe is aimless, why do living beings have aims when inanimate things do not?
Right. So here's one way to frame the mystery. Nothing your body does defies the laws of physics and chemistry. There's no added materials, there's no non-thing things, no supernatural. Whether there's something supernatural in there or not, science is a campaign to find natural explanations for all natural phenomena. So you're nothing but physics and chemistry, and yet you act radically different from this, which will simply degenerate over time. You are regenerating yourself, and that is true of the tree, that's true of all organisms, and had to be true of the first organism. So how did that start?
Okay.
And what is it? What is it what is your selfhood, your soul, your spirit? I don't care what you name it, you've still got to explain it. The name is basically a flag you've put over what needs to be explained. It doesn't explain anything, and there's no use bickering about whether we're going to call a self or an agent or a soul or a spirit. The name isn't the issue. What is that difference?
Okay. And do you think that we currently have the tools in science to explain things like consciousness and the origins of life using the models that we have, like for example, the periodic table of elements, the standard model of particle physics, and the four fundamental forces in physics?
Yes.
Or do you think they're sufficient to describe everything here?
Yes, not just those laws. I think a crucial new recognition, which goes by the name self-organization, which is a terrible name for it. I'll call it emergent constraint. It's basically the recognition of the kind of thing we experience if we're threading our way through a crowd. So you're threading your way through a crowd and others have to thread around you, and the crowd self-simplifies into flows. This would be true of whirlpools as well. Self-organization has been an important topic. Now there are a bunch of people who have, based on this discovery, want to argue that's all there is to life. But no, the threading through the crowd dissipates the crowd. A whirlpool at the drain in a bathtub actually drains the water faster. It's a self-undermining system. And yet, the broad answer to your question is yes, I think that is now this season's question that we can answer. There are a bunch of questions that actually I wouldn't even touch. They're for later generations. We're not there yet, but I will argue that we can begin to posit careful, testable hypotheses about how you get mattering from matter. And these become proof of principle. As we have today no model for how you ever move from molecules to mattering, and we need them. And so the question is, can you corner yourself with that question long enough to figure it out? And emergent constraint, what I want to suggest about it is, it's a change in likelihood. It's actually a prevention of, so that crowd scene where you're threading your way through, there are all sorts of possible paths. But what happens is some paths become less likely and others become more likely. So that's where the book goes. We have a molecular model for how, though you are just chemistry, you are not just any chemistry. You are preventing all of the chemistry that would lead to you petering out. And as a result, you end up regenerating yourself. It's actually a prevention of things. It's not something added. It's not something on top of physics and chemistry. It's a constraint on the things that happen in physics and chemistry.
Now we have a few people at this conference that will talk over the next few days that have some very controversial theories.
Yes, all of them would be at this point.
Okay. For example, Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose are here. They have a very famous theory, quantum-based theory of consciousness called orchestrated objective reduction.
Yes.
Do you think that has any basis from your viewpoint?
So the fascinating move is to leap from physics to consciousness without paying attention to living. So Anil Seth was someone who made this point yesterday. what consciousness is some peculiar variation on living. And if you can't even explain what living is, you're not going to get very far with explaining consciousness. Now, Deacon, he had written an important book on the origins of language. He was all over questions of consciousness. And then he realized he actually had to backtrack and pay attention to trying from its start. Effortful, functional, fitted behavior. Recognizing that evolution doesn't solve it. The tendency here will be to say, well, evolution handles everything in the middle. And if you got to explain consciousness, look for the material thing that makes it possible. I'm a naturalist, I'm not a materialist. I know that changes in likeliness are actually natural, and yet they're not material things. So I'm paying attention to the natural world only. You can't jump out and posit imaginary things, and yet I think they do a bit through their equivocation. And in the process, they're missing the question that we have to deal with now. So back to your question about consciousness, can we solve it now? Nah, maybe your generation, not mine. Can we explain it? But explaining the origins of agency, yeah, I think we're there, and we have to start there. Deacon has sometimes commented that trying to explain living behavior starting with consciousness is like trying to explain hair starting with porcupine quills. Yeah, they're hair. They're very specialized, highly evolved hair. Not a great place to start if you want to understand the core of this. And all sorts of hard problems become easier if you actually understand how value enters the universe in the first place. Not as a thing from outside, but how you get a system that values its own persistence.
I saw Edward Witten, the guy who devised M theory, that is combining the 5 existing string theory versions into one. And he said that we're going to come up with a theory for everything, combining relativity and what do you call it? Relativity and via a string theory model in the next 20 to 30 years. But consciousness will forever remain a mystery to mankind. I tend to agree with him on that. I mean, from what I've seen, really advanced models of how the brain works, etc., and how and perception. And how we need to go beyond what is understood of biological perception in some cases to achieve consciousness. But I'm not convinced because we haven't even been able to replicate the most simple life form, like a paramecium that has...
Simpler than that, you have to start simpler, but
yeah, we can't even build that from scratch.
Yes, and I'm saying the science is broken here. No one here is making a distinction between cause and effect and means to ends interpretation. They are radically different. A stop sign doesn't cause you to stop unless you crash into it. Rather, you interpret it as about something for you, and that's true of the tree too. It's doing it, it's not feeling it, it's not conscious of it, it has no conceptions of it, and yet it is still interpreting. So you have this problem in this area where the terms you have to use are either going to come from the mechanical side or from the anthropomorphic side. It's really hard to find words, but I'm going to argue for a broadened yet precise definition that includes a tree as a self that is interpreting. And I don't mean to imply that it's got feelings or consciousness. Until we can distinguish between interpretation and causality, we're just using a blunt instrument to try to explain everything out. And all these models, they actually capture features of it, like integrated information theory. Yeah, it captures a feature, but it makes this move from cause and effect to means to ends. And no, that won't work. If you go at it that way, you're not going to be able to solve this mystery. Now, there are plenty of people who don't want to solve the mystery because it leaves wide open the space for the supernatural or for abstract hand-waving. That's not my game. It's a perfectly good romantic thing to do, which is to prise open some gaps and then drop in whatever you want, but it's just not my game. That's not a scientific game.
So I feel we're not far from being able to assimilate all the molecules in the correct formation to replicate the most simple life form, which at the currently is probably a chlamydia bacteria. They have the shortest genome length.
Yeah, we're starting way more basic than that.
Okay.
Because even if you can engineer something like that, you suffer from what in the book I call amnesic watchmaker syndrome, which is you made the thing, and then you can claim that it says something about the origins of life by forgetting that you made it. No, if you're going to do this work right, in my opinion and Deacon's opinion, you have to start with a universe that has no engineers, no evolution, nothing but cause and effect, and at the level at which we're operating, which is the collapsed wave function. I mean, it's basically classical chemistry. And you have to imagine how by accident you would get something that is trying. We'll argue it doesn't start with a template molecule like RNA. It certainly doesn't start with RNA molecules replicating. Replication theory doesn't explain trying. They're not trying to replicate. And we also have to avoid this idea that if you just get enough replication, then it crosses some threshold and suddenly it's alive and trying. No, we have to explain how you get a simple enough system, and it's got to be really simple if it starts from chemistry and there's no engineers and no evolution.
So you're looking for a autonomously growing, replicating system of molecules that precedes genetic.
Yes, and then so in this book I explain how it could then evolve the use of a template molecule. But you're right, and so the core features we're looking for, they're not material causes, they're not material in their definition. Basically, what life is up against is the tendency for everything to degenerate, everything to peter out. So life has to regenerate faster than it would otherwise degenerate. That's the focused, narrowed work we do by preventing all of the degenerative work. What does that entail? First and foremost, it entails self-repair. That is, you can't even replicate if you are degraded. So you have to be constantly self-repairing, or you have to be recurringly self-repairing. You also have to protect against the elements that would otherwise degrade you, though not continuously, which is an interesting factor here, and only then self-replication. It's not about growth, it's not about reproduction, it's about, at core, most fundamentally, it's about regenerating faster than you would otherwise degenerate. So we have to have a system that arrives by accident out of classical chemistry that regenerates itself, not that it's consciously trying to, and yet it is trying because it's doing focused work for its own benefit. And the interesting part of this, just to tie it all back around, self-protection means being closed. Self-repair and self-reproduction requires the throughput of energy and resources. So you need selective interaction from the start, and you are not going to get it through some chance semi-permeable membrane. So you can't start with a closed system. It would have to start, we argue, with a system that is closed sometimes and wide open, loose molecules that have a tendency to reclose. That's how we solve this, it at the impossibly simple level of spontaneous emergence from chemistry with nothing trying to make it emerge.
I did a little research in my undergrad on prion proteins, and they seem to me like an ideal model for the origins of life.
Yes, it is a notion that comes up, but notice what you've got. They're proteins. Now, I had a conversation today with George Ellis, the mathematician. He will argue that proteins, once you have biomolecules like proteins, they can engage in some logic. So he's a mathematician, and there you've got life. And we started talking about it. He said, no, not by themselves, it's their organization. And I pointed out, he respects this work a lot. He respects Terry's work a lot. But he said, what's the organization? I said, yeah, we're trying to specify what the organization is and how it could spontaneously emerge. Imagine this, I got two chain reactions next to each other. They're replicating. Let's say that they're prions. Okay, I've got two systems where the prions are replicating. Now, from the outside, I can consider that to be like a competition, a natural selection competition. But the molecules themselves are not trying, they're not doing any constrained work on their own behalf. They're still passive to the process. I got to find some proactivity. I've got to see a way in which, from our framing, A self is a constraint that channels energy into work that regenerates the constraint. It's not an imposed constraint, it's an emergent constraint. And it's not at the level of self-organization, it's actually one level up. So the thing is, I could look at these prions and say, oh look, these are copying more, but that's in the eye of the beholder. I actually have to see something that is trying on its own behalf. So this impressionism is a problem in science. It's one of the reasons why you get there was a guy yesterday who said the function of evolution is reproduction. Wait, evolution is the second law of thermodynamics. It's stuff falling apart. It's how you get variation, it's how you get death. So no, it doesn't have a function. It's not selecting. That's a figure of speech and kind of a poor choice. It's not choosing on its own behalf. The business end of it is the organism, the agency. That's the one that's working against the degeneration. And so that's why I would have questions about prions or any molecular replication as the source of the origins of life.
Okay.
But good try.
Yeah.
You almost copied a prion of an idea to my mind.
Okay.
I'm just kidding.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
A pleasure.
Yeah.
A real pleasure. Thanks a lot.